Why is Israel's recognition of Somaliland the moral, strategic, and the sane action to do? From the dawn of time, nations have risen, empires have formed, and then they have one by one fallen, only for others to rise in their place. Borders shifted, powers changed, countries rose, states fell. Ways of thinking, ways of doing shifted in the sands of time until the post-World War II order emerged and the world decided to pretend that they could order the march of time to stop. This is causality. The news reports the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. My name is Shalom Bar Eretz. I have a background in international relations, political science, and sociology, and I'm also a major in the IDF reserves. On this channel, we look behind the scenes to see the reasons why events happen the way they do. Under the collective trauma that was World War II, it was decided that borders would be fixed. Countries had to stay the same, except only in the most extreme cases. And this can only be true when there becomes this full consensus around the issue of how might a new country form. When it was still new, there was still room for minor alterations here or there. Post-colonialism begot new states, but almost always along colonial borders. The same was true for also the post-Soviet states. But slowly the system has become more rigid, harder. Yet, to everyone's dismay, the march of time hasn't actually stopped. Slowly but surely, the lines on the map, which we pretend to be true, have drifted further and further from reality. Non-state actors, terrorist groups seizing territory, unrecognized states, and an amalgam of fiefdoms, all unrecognized as legitimate, now fill that void, giving vehicles for history to continue outside the realms of what was decreed legitimate. And so they stand outside that law, under the fiction they simply do not exist, simply because we claim they do not. One such example is Somaliland, on the Horn of Africa, which is one of the most absurd of cases since it was at one time independent. So it would have the closest claim to legitimacy of any of these non-state actors almost under the current rule-based system. But even so, it is a state which has been shunned and not talked about because it committed the sin of trying to participate in a failed marriage with its failed former partner to the south. This is because veto power over its very existence has been given to the least likely to agree on territorial secession, that failed partner, Somalia, out of fear that it might serve as precedent for other breakaway states in Africa and around the world. This is because almost the only time when new states are recognized is when there was an amicable separation, such as in South Sudan, or if there was a large-scale international agreement and intervention, such as Kosovo. But that's official recognition. Right across the narrow sea, there is another state that we pretend isn't a state, and that is the Houthis. But as opposed to Somaliland, the Houthis don't really care that much, I don't think, that they're unrecognized. They make their claim through force of arms, territorial threats, missiles, and in doing so, they have entered negotiations with powers near and far. That is the absurdity of the world we have created. Those most deserving of statehood are cast aside, while those willing to throw away all the rules of order and decency make themselves heard by use of force. They compel the world to deal with them through their acts of violence. Whereas Somaliland, being peaceful, democratic, and trying to follow international norms, is shunned. International order and human institutions are important. They are the infrastructure that guides society. We can view them like dams across a river. They can stop the flow, they can mold it, they can bend society into something whose force can be managed, utilized, harnessed. But you cannot pretend that the dam you placed decades before needs no maintenance and no spillway and no rethinking when topography changes, when mountains move, and history has moved on. There are limits as to how institutions and norms can shape the human interactions, and when they reach that limit, they break. if we don't look at the rules of the international order and see what needs to be changed every so often, if we don't attempt to define how we can better use, divert, and shift the forces of history involved, rather than trying to cling to an old design that has long lost its reasoning, if we don't do that, then eventually the dams will crack and then they will fail, and we will all be swept away in the flood. Institutions, and here I mean by that states and borders and laws and recognition and all that entails, are strong. They can refocus forces into different directions, but only to a point. Institutions only paper over so much disconnect from reality. I'm not going to get into here what a state is. There are many definitions, from Weber's Monopoly on Power to the Montevideo Convention. But I think more importantly, statehood is closer to that old Supreme Court judgment. You know it when you see it. While hard to describe and define, it's clear when an actor has the power of a state. But more and more of these states are unrecognized, or they are called something else under a fiction. As time goes by, the map that was agreed upon becomes more and more of that fiction. The main problem is that the ways that we have put in place in order to guide those forces and update the map are woefully not up to the task. Under the current system, states are only officially recognized when all involved parties agree on the matter, which means that you are always going to place a new state's legitimacy in the hand of the very country it is trying to break away from, regardless of the actual control it has over its own territory. That is not to say that recognition shouldn't be a fundamental part of the process, partly because, as referenced above, you know it when you see it is the prime definition of a state. It is a subjective viewpoint. But currently, country recognition has become something else entirely. It's become a declaration of whether you agree with the state's existence or even its minute policies, rather than a statement of whether the state actually exists. When this has become the case and it has become so disconnected from reality, then it can no longer be the deciding factor. There are many other tools for showing disapproval towards states. Recognizing a state shouldn't mean that you approve even of its existence. You can choose not to deal with a state. You can sanction a state. You cannot have any diplomatic relations with a state. But there is a difference between those tools and pretending that the state doesn't exist. It would serve all parties to look at reality and call a state a state, a state a state. With Somaliland, and I'm not going to get into all the ins and outs of the case, but many countries are against recognizing it because it is thought that it might breed separatism in other parts of Africa and around the world. But that fear is irrelevant to understanding how reality works. Instead of pretending that by not recognizing Somaliland, you have placed an indefinite lid on any and all African separatism, perhaps it would be better to supply real, non-violent avenues for groups to gain statehood or autonomy within their current state. Papering over the issue isn't actually going to solve anything. It is only to kick the can further down the line and ensure that when people do want self-determination, violence is the only avenue they have to gain it. To see the other side of this equation and to show that this argument isn't only one of convenience, formed in order to justify recognizing Somaliland, I think it is illustrative to look at the Houthis. I don't agree with the Houthis. I don't think the Houthis should exist as a state, but I would be a fool to cover my eyes and pretend that they don't exist. The Houthi state exists, and recognizing that simple fact shouldn't come with the implication that I agree that it should exist, or with its policies. At the moment, saying something exists has this connotation that you agree with it, and that doing so would set a bad precedent. I think we need to normalize the ideas that states can form and then fade away in an orderly manner, so that violence no longer is the only way for them to get a modicum of independence, such as the Houthis have done. The irony is that only because Somaliland is peaceful, only because Somaliland is stable, only because Somaliland hasn't turned itself into a scourge upon its neighbors, can the world turn its back on it and ignore it without consequence. Israel's recognition of Somaliland is therefore not only the strategically correct thing, but the moral thing. There has been many different theories put forward as to why this is in Israel's national interest, and I'm not going to get into all of the different calculuses involved, but fundamentally, just because you undertake something that has multiple interests involved doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. Here it just means you have another reason to do something which is right. Of course, Israel isn't unfamiliar with the politics of recognition, as of course, so many countries don't recognize Israel's existence. Well, I can assure you, we do. Those who fail to recognize us should ask themselves a simple question. Has this non-recognition served any purpose? Sure, some countries don't have diplomatic relations with us, but my point is that if your aim is that, well, that could be accomplished by other means. This is not to say that everyone should love us and enjoy us. This is to say that to deny our existence is foolish. This attitude towards Israel only turns part of the international community into clowns, accomplishing nothing but furthering their own ridiculousness. This farce is extended even more when some of those same countries simultaneously pretend a state exists where it doesn't. There is no state of Palestine. I can assure you, it doesn't exist. Because as I said before, you know it when you see it. And I've seen it. Recognition doesn't change facts on the ground. It only tries to force a fantasy onto reality, which is only valid in the theater of delusional world politics. I think over the last few years, Israel has shown that it isn't simply applying this logic when convenient. It is not only applied to a potential friends. Being clear-eyed and seeing reality as it is essential. And that is why I think Israel has dealt with the Houthis as if they are a state, a terrorist state who wants our destruction. That's on their flag. If we were simply to deny their existence, we could not defeat them. Hamastan is also something that was once a thing, and currently is somewhat of a going concern, even though I hope it will no longer be so much longer. Acknowledging that has no bearing on their legitimacy or an endorsement of their actions. It only lets us understand the nature of the beast and understand how to defeat it. Hamas and the international community has used this gray area to their advantage by treating Hamas as if it was just a terrorist group and not representative of the people of Gaza, as they were their ruling government. A democratically elected ruling government at that. No matter how many countries gather around a table and decide to believe in a delusion, that doesn't make the delusion real. Yes, there is power in social constructs, institutions, norms, and even the crazy things that people say. But that power only extends so far. When people convince themselves that they prefer to act in accordance to a fiction untethered to reality, the best outcome is a farce, and the likely outcome is bloodshed. Of course, not everything is a state, and there should be standards, but because of the strict rules placed on what is and is not a state, which first and foremost mainly get their guidance from the lines on a map of World War II, we have caused a greater absurdity. It has been 80 years since World War II ended. History has continued its forward march, but the lines have stayed ostensibly largely the same. This is not to say that there isn't a real concern that if states' borders are no longer sacrosanct, then wars might be more readily available. There is a reason why people have tried to avoid these hard questions. But if you look around, there still are wars. And because the system is calcified, because the water is overflowing the dam, because the cracks are forming, it only means that it is imperative that new ways of allowing for a functioning world system are found. Ways that give voice and legitimacy beyond simple recognition and veto power. Having avenues for independence, having avenues for border change in calm and peaceful manners. It is the only way to manage the flow of history and fix the dam. Instead of pretending that everything is okay and waiting for the dam to collapse. We should strive for a system that both provides stability but leaves room and flexibility for changes to happen in the most peaceful and organized way possible. The West also needs to realize that even though something that the current state of affairs might suit its interests, if the present rigid system is doomed to failure, then whether it is good or bad is besides the point. Rising powers increasingly don't feel constrained by these rules and deal with whoever and whenever in whatever way they want, working within the system when it suits them and outside of it when it doesn't. As these rules are ever increasingly ignored, the system is already changing, with new norms being formed outside the Western-backed system. But since most in the West wish to cling to the old, advantageous to them ways, the new system is being advanced by those most willing to break those rules and forge new paths. It is then in the West's best interest to reform their rules and create a workable, flexible system, rather than concede the field and only realize too late that they are now subjects to norms they had no hand in shaping. We can begin to bring flexibility to the system to repair the dam by simply lowering the bar and norms for international recognition. The time has come to stop looking for political consensus that is never going to arise, and in doing so, we can end the absurd practice of handing veto power to the very state a breakaway entity is seeking to leave. This simple shift can help close the gap between the facts on the ground and the political map we hang on the wall, making the recognition of a state's existence an act of pragmatic realization of reality and not a political declaration of approval. Since the dawn of time, we understood how to do this. This isn't new. And yes, not everything will fit nicely into a nice little box. I don't think it is necessary either to be hung up on definitions, which are usually ignored in any case, of what a state is and is not, and we can realize that we know it when we see it. In the complex world we live in, any definition would deprive statehood from real states and give it to non-states. That is to say, the principle of recognition should play a major role in deciding what is a state and what is not a state, but it needs to be based on reality and not ideology. I understand that what I'm proposing isn't clean and is complex, but dealing with complexity is far better than forcing the world to live in a delusion. This is what I think Israel has done in Somaliland by recognizing it, and more importantly, by dealing with it as a state which aligns with its interests and has the capability of entering and upholding agreements. But this is also effectively what Israel did with Hamasistan and with the Houthis by dealing with them as state belligerents and not giving them the benefit of pretending to be a mere terrorist group. Israel has clearly stated that the emperor has no clothes, and delusions shouldn't dictate interests. If more countries follow suit and start dealing with countries capable of being dealt with, and hopefully not confuse recognition as endorsement, the world will naturally become a more dynamic place where new avenues of self-determination will naturally rise to the surface. I think this should also be coupled with recognition that not every polity needs to fit a cookie-cutter Westphalian definition of statehood, and we can recognize the plethora of ways people are actually governed in today's world, from tribal alliances to local autonomies and even things like the EU. But those are topics for future videos. My central point is this: we need to add flexibility to the system. We need to add resilience to the system, because if not, the system will simply break, as signs have already shown that it is breaking, not only in the Horn of Africa and across the Strait in Yemen, but in Russia, in Taiwan, and almost everywhere else. History hasn't stopped, no matter what anyone says. To pretend that it has is to live in delusion, which will ultimately make us all pay the eventual price. Again, this is causality. The news for the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. You can support the channel by liking and subscribing, by following me on X, and visiting me on Patreon, where I post free articles about topics not suited to the YouTube algorithm. Until next time, take care.